All right, so I've been silent for a while. I've been down for a minute, as it were, mostly just because I was very busy. I went through the entire winter doing two jobs at once, and then through the summer doing close to about 80 hours a week in the one job that I had at that time, and now I'm actually out of work. So it's been a long year. It's been a lot to take in, just emotionally and spiritually. Started off at the beginning of the year thinking that by this time I would be pastoring a congregation in another state. That ended up not working. It's just, there's been a lot going on. And of course, we still got an election year ahead of us, or an election ahead of us. It's about 3 weeks away. And just what is going on, right? I know that I'm not alone in terms of just having a chaotic and challenging and even frustrating year. I've adopted a new hobby recently. At this point in time, it's just been assembling and painting. I haven't actually played with them yet. This is a hobby that I've been wanting to get into a long time. Just haven't had an opportunity to do so, even though I've read a lot of the print materials that go along with it. I've just been on the fringes of it, mostly because it was just cost ineffective. An army of custodies is like, or any type really, is like $150. It was just always way outside my cash flow range until recently. But anyway, and also didn't have any time. These things sat on my desk in the box for about 6 weeks before I even got them out and everything like that. So now that I've got some free time, I've been, whatever you want to call it, wasting it, investing it, I don't know. Hiding from the electoral nonsense, mainly, is what I've been doing, if I can be totally honest. And so let's approach the elephant in the room that everyone has, and that is, how should you vote? I've talked about this in previous election years, of that we live in a very estranged political climate compared to anything that was happening in the time in which the Bible was being written. They had an authoritarian dictatorship in the actual sense, not the rhetorical, smear your political opponent's sense that we live in now. And so there wasn't a general electoral gathering every 2 to 4 years that people had to deal with. That's not the way it was back then. There was an imperial line of succession that chose leaders. Yes, there was a Senate. It was almost ornamental at that time, especially at the time of Christ, in which the emperor did what he pleases, and there was very little contradiction to that, aside from the occasional bloody coup. So you can try to rhetorically weaponize some of those events as an allegory or something like that that's happening now, but recognize that it's purely rhetorical. And we should also recognize that for all the rhetoric about peaceful transfer of power, something you should know about most of the world is assassination and violence and things of that nature are par for the course for probably 2/3, probably closer to 3/4 of the world's political climates. That they're run by militarized dictatorships, or they are essentially absent. Like the idea that if you were to stop a law enforcement officer, they would actually have the ability to help you with something here in the United States is totally foreign to other places. Any interaction with law enforcement, the police, the military in most of the world is usually only reconcilable through bribery, through threats, through other forms of transfer of currency. And so we live in a very different Overton window in a lot of ways than the rest of the world does. And we should recognize that and thank God for it. That, yeah, there's been some assassination. There's been some attempts this time. But the reason that shocks us as much as it does is it's so uncommon. There hasn't been someone attempt to do something like that on a presidential candidate since Reagan. And before that, we're talking about JFK. And before that, we're talking about James A. Garfield, Abraham Lincoln. Like, we're talking about a long time ago, in our memory at least. These things don't happen here. And so we should definitely be grateful that peace is so much of an assumed predisposition in our culture, that chaos and conflict is an outlier, even as much as it's become more and more common now. We should definitely be grateful for that. We should reflect on it with gratitude to God that that is the way here, because that's not usually the way. But let's also not squander the opportunity that it provides us, and let us not consider these things too lightly, trivially. The opportunity that that we do have some democratic influence on our leadership. That's an uncommon thing historically and even in the present tense as well. So, what do we do with it? How should you vote? And I'll approach this a few ways. The first would be the morally conscious non-believer. So someone who is not a Christian, doesn't identify themselves as a Christian, but does want to be morally guided in how to use that influence. Should you vote is the first gateway, and the answer is yes. If you are old enough to participate in this process, you should participate in it. To sit on the sidelines is simply unwise. The second thing is, what is the most important thing? Obviously, rights, right? Well, what's the most fundamental right? Life, right? It's like the idea that you have the right to life is the fundamental foundation upon which all the rest are structured. If you're not alive, then speech, assembly, all the rest, like firearms, everything else that goes along with it, all those things are secondary. And so if a person isn't supportive of a principle of defending life, I don't know how you would justify voting for them. And that's even if you're not a believer. If you're a Christian, this actually becomes far more difficult because of the fact that none of these currently kind of these primary front-running candidates are really pro-life. Neither one of them are. At least Trump at one point had run more or less on a principle of being pro-life, but from his rhetoric, at least the way I've ascertained it, is that with Roe versus Wade being overturned in the Supreme Court, he doesn't seem to view it as a contentious issue anymore, and so he's not really drawing hard and fast lines on where he falls, and that's concerning to me. Maybe not to everyone else, but to me, I find that to be troublesome. So that's something to be considerate of the, is he pro-life? Because we know that the other one on the ticket, Kamala Harris, is definitely not pro-life, and yet she's actually made a pretty significant platform out of not being pro-life, about being against the principles of being pro-life. And so maybe that moves the needle slightly in one direction away from the other. Is that good enough? I don't know. This is a decision that you have to make prayerfully and with the informed wisdom of others around you. I don't think that you should ever try to make this decision in a vacuum for certain. So, who should you vote for? It's a difficult decision because I don't like either one of them. I don't. Just the reality is, I don't like either choice that has been set before me on this, and I'm not alone in that. I know it. So, what do you do? And what I would say is that you should definitely let your conscience lead you in this way. As long as it's informed by the Holy Spirit, you should let your conscience lead you here in some ways. But one thing about it is that you should make decisions on the basis of principles, not convenience. There's a lot of people that would argue in the direction of who you think is going to win, that you should throw your vote that way, out of just wanting to be on the winning side, and recognize that's just another one of the coward's way out on this. So, what do you do? It's a good question, and it's a difficult one, but I hope that you will be sensitive to the leading of the Holy Spirit, and that when the time comes, that you will be settled enough in your conscience that it won't haunt you, despite holding your nose, throwing in the ballot, the way many of us are likely going to have to do.